I haven't done one of these in a while. It's a breakdown video, and this is from the 9/11 Commission staff statement of Phillip Zelikow and Douglas MacEachin, who's a staff member. Phillip Zelikow is the director of the 9/11 Commission, and you can see it's dated June 14, 2004. Let's see what they have to say.
Members of the Commission, with your help, your staff has developed initial findings to present to the public on the nature of the enemy that carried out the September 11th attacks. In this statement, we will focus on Al-Qaeda's history and evolution and how this organization came to pose such a serious threat to the United States. These findings may help frame some of the issues for this hearing and inform the development of your judgments and recommendations. This report reflects the results of our work so far. We remain ready to revise our understanding of events as our investigation proceeds. This staff statement represents the collective effort of a number of members of our staff: Douglas MacEachin, Yoel Tobin, Nicole Grandremo, Sarah Linden, Thomas Dowling, John Roth, Douglas Greenberg, and Serena Willey did much of the investigative work reflected in this statement. We were fortunate in being able to build upon a great deal of excellent work already done by the intelligence community. Several executive branch agencies cooperated fully in making available documents and personnel for interviews. Roots of Al-Qaeda. In the 1980s, a large number of Muslims from the Middle East traveled to Afghanistan to join the Afghan people's war against the Soviet Union, which had invaded in 1979. Osama bin Laden was a significant player in this group, then known as the Afghan Arabs. A multimillionaire from a wealthy Saudi family, bin Laden used his personal wealth and connections to rich Arab contributors to facilitate the flow of fighters into Afghanistan. He provided extensive financing for an entity called the Bureau of Services, or Maktab al-Khidmat. This bureau operated a recruiting network.
Oh, okay. A little bit of background on this because he isn't necessarily giving you the whole history. Now, the Maktab al-Khidmat was a bureau that was created by none other than Palestinian Imam Abdullah Yusuf Azam with the help of an Algerian foreign fighter, Abdullah Anas. And what they wanted was to build on a recruitment center that would help foreign Arabs from around the world to come and train to fight in the Soviet invasion of the Afghan war. And this place would be held in Pakistan, Peshawar, and it had to get through approval from a notable Afghan warlord named Abdul Rasul Sayyaf, who is one of the largest, most influential warlords in all of Pakistan. And a lot of these Afghans didn't want Arabs within their ranks because they found the Arabs would be inferior fighters, that the Afghans were, and they come from a very different school of thought. They're from the Hanafi school of thought, while these Arabs were basically Wahhabis. There are some similarities within the schools, but there are a lot of differences. Nevertheless, the Maktab al-Khidmat, or the Afghan Services Bureau, had to get proper funding, and that funding comes from Osama bin Laden. But he wasn't the only person that was given financial aid to the Afghan Services Bureau. You had the largest and most successful CIA operation in history, Operation Cyclone, but it didn't come directly from the CIA because that would be an instigator for the war, probably would have caused World War III. However, what they did was they dealt primarily with the Pakistan ISI, the Inter-Services Agency, and they dealt with them. So in any type of weapons or funding went from the CIA, went through the ISI, and the ISI basically helped in the recruitment and financing of these Arabs that came from all over Southeast Asia and the United States, even in Europa. So the Maktab al-Khidmat wasn't under the guidance of bin Laden until much later, when a notable influx of Arabs started replacing the slaughtered Afghans during the war. And these Arabs didn't like non-governmental organizations or NGOs because they thought that what they didn't want, Abdul Azam was basically the instigator in this, because he wanted this to be seen as a Muslim war, not as a US proxy war for Afghanistan. And so they didn't want any outsiders or foreigners to be involved with the recruitment or within the war itself. And so there was this huge influx of foreign Arabs who were actually much more nastier than their Afghan counterparts. And then later on, during 1988, near the end of the war, Abdullah Azzam was actually voted out once the Egyptian Takfiris came in, the Takfiris, Muslims who are Muslims who condemn other Muslims as fake Muslims or Munafiq Takfir. And so what they did was the Egyptians persuaded bin Laden to basically have him as the leader of the Maktab al-Kidmat, pushing out Abdul Azzam. In fact, Dr. Ayman al-Swahari, who is the co-emir of the Egyptian Islamic Jihad, basically started spreading nasty rumors about Abdul Azzam, claiming that he was a Zionist agent and an agent for the United States and for Pakistan. And so a lot of the Arabs turned against Azzam, and then he was forced out. And one of the best books on the subject is written by Dr. Thomas Hedgehammer, and it's called The Caravan. And it's the best biography in the world regarding Abdul Azzam, and I suggest everybody to read it. It's a lengthy read, 700 pages, but it's well documented. I believe there are 10 years worth of references in the book, and he spent about 10 years writing the book. It's fantastic. So that's a little bit of the history regarding the Maktab al-Kidmat that Zelikow won't tell you.
Worked in Muslim communities throughout the Middle East, Southeast Asia, Western Europe, and the United States. It provided travel funds and guest houses in Pakistan for recruits and volunteers on the road to the Afghan battlefield.
Yeah, the Maktab al-Kidmat, by the way, Maktab al-Kidmat had different types of houses. I think there was 8 houses that were based in Peshawar. And what they did was they had a military committee, a religious committee, a widows committee, a financing committee, all different houses that basically catered to different aspects of recruiting and training these Arabs.
Bin Laden also used his financial network to set up training camps and procure weapons and supplies for Arab fighters. Major Afghan warlords who led forces in the battle against the Soviets also benefited from the use of these camps.
Okay, a little bit of history about this, because again, Zelikow won't tell you, is that the Afghans didn't want Arabs to open up their own training camps. What happened is there's a great book by Ann Sterenson from the ICS, who basically wrote a great book, and it's the most valuable book I've ever written, one of the most invaluable books I've ever read, called Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. And it's one of the rare books that talks about the beginning stages of Al-Qaeda. And so Al-Qaeda didn't start out as a terrorist organization. Actually, they started out as a training camp called Al-Masada. And from the Arabic, that means the lion's den. And Osama bin Laden needed permission to open up this training camp from Afghan warlords. One of them was Abdul Rasul Sayyaf, who didn't mind Arabs in his ranks. In fact, there were 2 Afghan warlords who basically allowed Arabs to join with their Afghan counterparts. That's Abdul Rasul Sayyaf and Jalaluddin Haqqani. And he later on would create the Haqqani network, which basically is still in existence today. And they were the only warlords to basically allow Arabs to fight with them. And what happened was when bin Laden opened up the training camp in Paktia province, he got the permission of Abdul Rasul Sayyaf and his associate called the engineer. And basically bin Laden sent 2 associates to find this area where they would build this camp. And this camp would cater just to Arabs. And they would, train in small arms fire, handguns, something for guerrilla type warfare. It wasn't like a camp building bombs and whatnot. It wasn't like that. And later on, this camp grew notoriety because one day the Soviet Spetsnaz, which is actually the Soviet special forces, raided the camp, and they actually lost in a very infamous battle. It was a very important battle because they were, I think, approximately like 25 Arabs against like 130 Spetsnaz soldiers, and the Arabs won. And it's basically catapulted bin Laden, catapulted the Arabs in the Afghans' eyes. And then they started getting more permission to open up training camps. And that's where Al-Qaeda came from. Al-Qaeda came from this training camp because all the Arabs that were training here, the beginning people that were training at these training camps, they were the founders or the founding fathers of Al Qaeda, which was basically called the base meaning Al Masada training base, not a database that French conspiracy theorists like to imagine.
Following the defeat of the Soviets in the late 1980s, bin Laden formed an organization called the Foundation, quote unquote, or Al-Qaeda in Arabic. Al-Qaeda was intended to serve as a foundation upon which to build a global Islamic army.
Well, that's, again, Zelikow's not entirely telling you the truth. So when bin Laden, after the war, bin Laden went back to Saudi Arabia and basically pleaded with the Saudi royal family, King Fahd, Prince Turki bin Al-Faisal, who's the head of the Saudi General Intelligence Directorate, the intelligence service of the Saudi Arabian Kingdom, that he was going to use the Arab Mujahideen fighters to fight off Saddam Hussein's invading army once he invaded Kuwait, because the rumor was Saudi Arabia was next. The kingdom basically thought the idea was preposterous, and instead they basically invited the United States to come and basically build a military camp in the most holiest site of all Islam, Mecca and Medina. Bin Laden saw this as an insult, and so you had a lot of Saudi sympathizers from the Wahhabi school of thought who basically sympathized with bin Laden. And what happened was bin Laden put a deal with Prince Turki bin Faisal that they would unfreeze his assets and give him back his passport, but he would have to leave the country. And basically what he did was he relocated to the Sudan under the influence of National Islamic Front leader Hassan Turabi. And so Omar al-Bashir, who's the president of Sudan is the only country at that time in the world that didn't require Arabs to show passports to enter the country. Well, that's very convenient. And so what happened was bin Laden, and along with his Arab Mujahideen and the members of the Egyptian Islamic group, basically went with them. And from there, they started spending millions of dollars in the infrastructure of Sudan. And while doing so, they built these training camps. And in these training camps, they started building Al-Qaeda. Again, even at this time, Al-Qaeda was not an international terrorist organization. Now, we do have early documents and files that are called the Tariq and Osama documents. Now, they're in Arabic, but there's very few websites that have this downloaded. You can see that these documents basically talk about Al-Qaeda as an organization where they would swear bayat, which means loyalty in Arabic. So these people that would swear bayat loyalty to bin Laden and the group would have to file this form basically showing that where they were from, what skills they have, and that's how they built this organization. And they built the organization on a military committee, which is the Shura Committee. They had a military committee and a Shura Committee. The Shura Committee is the religious committee. And then later on, they added a media committee, which is the As-Sahab media arm. It's still in existence today. And they had committees just like the Maktab al-Khidmat. Hopefully that helped you to understand.
In 1989, the regime in Sudan, run by a military faction and an Islamic extremist organization called the National Islamic Front, invited bin Laden to move there. He sent an advance team to Sudan in 1990 and moved there in mid-1991. Bin Laden brought resources to Sudan, building roads and helping finance the government's war against separatists in the south. In return, he received permission to establish commercial enterprises and an operational infrastructure to support terrorism. By 1992...
But they didn't, okay, let me quickly say this here. Al-Qaeda at this point didn't have a political agenda. There wasn't a war against the United States or Israel or the West. Now, later on, through the influence of the Egyptians like Dr. Ahmed al-Zawahiri, Said Imam al-Sharif, known as Dr. Fadl, Abu Hafs al-Masri, also known as Muhammad Atef, Abu Ubaidah al-Banshiri. A lot of these Egyptians were basically military type people that served in the Egyptian military that were at war with the late President Anwar Sadat and Hosni Mubarak for years. Okay, these are people that came from the old line, from the Cairo University schools. These were basically Takfiri Egyptians who adhered to the principles of Hassan al-Banna, the Muslim Brotherhood, and Sayyid Qutb. And what they wanted to do was basically overthrow the Egyptian government and create an Islamic government in Egypt. And from there, they would try to subvert all the secular Arab governments led by a former ideology called Pan-Arabism or Arab socialism, and to replace these governments with religious governments and then create a caliphate and then go to war against the United States and the West, because then there would be a formidable army. But that would take way too long to achieve. And later on, this ideology, which was called the near enemy and the far enemy approach, basically was thrusted to the far enemy approach first, the war against the United States and Israel and the West, basically. So but that came much later. So Zelikow is like telling you that Al-Qaeda was built right away in Afghanistan. They were basically a terrorist organization. No, it's not true.
Was focused on attacking
Not entirely true.
the United States. He argued that other extremists, aimed at local rulers or Israel, had not gone far enough. They had not attacked what he called the head of the snake, the United States. He charged that the United States, in addition to backing Israel, kept in power repressive Arab regimes not true to Islam. He also excoriated the continued presence of U.S. military forces in Saudi Arabia after the Gulf War as a defilement of holy Muslim land. I'd now like to turn to Douglas MacEachin, a former Deputy Director of Intelligence of the CIA, to continue.
In Sudan, bin Laden built upon the al-Qaeda organization he had established back in Afghanistan. It had its own membership roster and a structure of committees to guide and oversee a variety of functions. At the top, the emir was bin Laden. He had a shura, or advisory council. It was made up of close associates, most of whom had served with him, long-standing ties going back to the days in Afghanistan. The Sharia and Political Committee was responsible for issuing what are called fatwas, edicts purporting to be grounded in Islamic law.
Yeah, okay, yeah, everything he's saying is true. But by the way, these fatwas were not respected by the Islamic community as a whole, because bin Laden or Dr. al-Zawahiri didn't have the authority from the imams in Saudi Arabia or from notable imams in like Jordan or Bahrain. You know, the religious scholars of the Sunni school of thought basically didn't recognize these fatwas because they were not made by actual religious edicts or imams, all right? Because bin Laden's not an imam and neither is Dr. al-Zawahiri. These are just Muslims who are head of a organization that is basically not theologically oriented or legitimate. That would be a better word. These are illiterates who basically use the ideologies of Hadith scholars like Ibn Taymiyyah, Ibn Hanbal, and not through Quranic scholars. And this is all originating from the Wahhabi school of thought by Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab. And that's what is the founding principles of Saudi Arabia. So they're not, these edicts are not respected.
Directing
Not recognized.
or authorizing certain actions, including authorizing deadly attacks. Military Committee for proposing targets, gathering ideas, supporting operations, managing training camps. Finance Committee responsible for fundraising, budgetary support for training camps, housing costs, living expenses, and also the movement of money.
Remember, a lot of this basically earlier came from the CIA Operation Cyclone. You know, they gave billions of dollars through these services bureaus. Now, remember also too there was a U.S. building, an extension of the Maktab al-Khidmat in the United States. In fact, two cities in particular. The first office was built in Arizona. The second office was built in the Al-Khifa Refugee Center in Brooklyn, New York, on Atlantic Avenue, right next door to the Al-Farouk Mosque. And basically what happened later on, the Bureau basically became part of the Al-Farouk Mosque upstairs. And it was under watch by the FBI as well. And a lot of these people that basically came from the Afghan war that, that were involved with, say, the 1993 World Trade Center bombing, like Mahmoud Abalima, Mohammed Salameh, some of these people came from the Afghan war. Where did they get their training from? Well, they got it from the CIA, the Pakistan ISI, British MI6, Israeli Mossad, and every other intelligence services that was involved with the war.
He allocated to
So that's where they got their training from.
terrorist operations. Foreign purchases.
Now, I want to clear this up too. There's this misconception that bin Laden's a CIA agent or asset. There's no evidence to suggest that he was. He had his own money. He hated the West, actually, and didn't want any help from a non-governmental organization, just like Yusuf Azam did. So basically, I wouldn't say that, I wouldn't dare say that a lot of that money from the CIA didn't trickle down to the Maktab al-Khidmat, because it certainly did. And that money then found its way to bin Laden without him knowing about it. Yeah, that's much more plausible. But there's absolutely zero evidence that he was a CIA asset named Tim Osman. And that's silly, by the way. There's no evidence to suggest that. Or that he was an actual CIA asset. There's no evidence to suggest that. In fact, later on, Dr. Ayman al-Swahiri wrote a book called Knights Under the Prophet's Banner. It's in Arabic, but there's also an English translated version, PDF form. You could Google it, where he basically addresses this conspiracy from the West, saying that this conspiracy was actually originating from the CIA itself.
He was responsible
I think that's funny.
for acquiring weapons, explosives, and technical equipment. The Security Committee for Physical Protection, an information committee in charge of propaganda. I need to emphasize that this organizational structure should not be read as defining a hierarchical chain of command for specific operations. It served mainly as a means for coordinating functions, providing material support to operations. But once a specific operation was decided upon, it would be assigned to a carefully selected clandestine cell headed by a senior al-Qaeda operative who reported personally to bin Laden. With al-Qaeda as its foundation, bin Laden sought to build a broader Islamic army that included terrorist groups from most of the Middle Eastern countries and Africa. Not all the groups that he approached joined, but most did. And he created a multinational council, in effect an Islamic Army Council, intended to promote common goals, coordinate targeting, and authorize asset sharing for terrorist operations. This represented a new level of collaboration among diverse terrorist groups. In Sudan, bin Laden set up training camps and weapons and supply depots. He used them to support his al-Qaeda organization and also other member groups of this Islamic army. Bin Laden's operatives used positions in the businesses that he'd set up as a cover to acquire weapons, explosives, and technical equipment. And to facilitate these activities, Sudanese intelligence officers provided false passports and shipping documents. At this time, bin Laden's operational role, or al-Qaeda's operational role, was mainly in providing the funds, training, and weapons for attacks that would be carried out by members of these other groups. Let me move forward to the launching of attacks on the United States. In December of 1992, an explosion outside two hotels in Aden, in Yemen, which was being used as a stopover for U.S. troops en route to Somalia, killed one Australian tourist and no Americans. U.S. intelligence would learn 4 years later that this attack was carried out by Yemeni terrorist groups, a Yemeni terrorist group, whose leader was very close to bin Laden, whose members reportedly were trained at a bin Laden-funded camp in Sudan that was run by a member of the al-Qaeda military committee.
Yeah, this actual bombing of this hotel was attributed to Al Qaeda, even though they never really took credit for it. So there is some discrepancy about whether they were actually involved with this or was it from a Yemeni affiliated group. Now, yeah, of course, on the flip side of that coin, Yemen is home to a lot of Al Qaeda affiliates, and an Al Qaeda cell actually exists in Yemen. It's the second biggest Al Qaeda cell outside of Afghanistan from 1996 to 2002.
In October of 1993, 2 Black Hawk helicopters were shot down. 18 U.S. soldiers were killed in Mogadishu, Somalia. U.S. intelligence learned in the ensuing years that bin Laden's organization had been heavily engaged in assisting the warlords who attacked U.S. forces in Somalia.
Yeah, now there's some truth to this. Now, of course, they're not going to tell you that one of those training these Somali militants was a triple agent himself, Ali Muhammad. Ali Muhammad was actually an informant for the CIA, the FBI, and was also a close, loyal follower of Osama bin Laden and Omar Abdul Rahman and Dr. Ayman al-Zawahiri. So basically, he was playing all sides of the fence, giving them information, telling Al Qaeda about his contacts within the United States. He actually was married to an American woman, had a house in San Francisco, basically was a part of the U.S. military, U.S. Army in Fort Bragg, North Carolina. And there's a lot of mystery behind Ali Muhammad and a lot of questions regarding what he knew, who did he tell, and what he got away with. And Ali Muhammad was actually with Abu Ubaidah al-Banshari, who was the military committee leader for Al-Qaeda at the time. And they were training these Somalian militants. And guess what? They were using Stinger missiles. Where did they get those Stinger missiles from and the RPGs? Well, they got it from Operation Cyclone, CIA operation during the Afghan-Russian war. Basically, those weapons were provided to them by the CIA. That's ironic because the weapons that were to knock down those Black Hawk helicopters came from the U.S. CIA. How about that?
The head of the al-Qaeda military committee from a command center in Nairobi, Kenya, reportedly sent scores of trainers into Somalia, including experts in the use of rocket-propelled grenades, the same kind of weapon that was used to shoot down those helicopters. Operatives dispatched to Somalia were told that their mission was, quote, to kill U.S. troops, incite violence against U.S. personnel, and undermine the success of the U.S. mission, close quote. Sources have described several of these operatives as bragging later that their work had caused the defeat of the Americans, and bin Laden and his senior associates touted the subsequent withdrawal of U.S. forces from Somalia in March of '94 as a victory for the Mujahideen and a demonstration that the Americans could be forced to retreat.
In fact, bin Laden actually said that he was quite surprised at the U.S. military's quick retreat from this conflict and stated that the Russians wouldn't dare retreat. In fact, during the Soviet war, he said the Russians were much more braver than the American special forces in Somalia. And this actually enticed bin Laden to try and attack and engage the U.S. military abroad. And when they didn't, then they had plans to attack the United States from within.
2 additional attacks in Saudi Arabia took place in 1995 and 1996, for which the evidence of bin Laden's involvement is much more ambiguous. On November 13, 1995, a car bomb exploded in Riyadh outside an office of the U.S.-trained Saudi Arabian National Guard. 5 Americans and 2 officials from India were killed. Saudi authorities quickly arrested 4 suspects, whom they quickly convicted and executed. The Saudis televised confessions of 3 perpetrators, indicating that their actions had been influenced by bin Laden, but there was no charge that bin Laden was directly involved.
Yeah, there's a little bit of history behind this too. Louis Freeh, the director of the FBI, basically was good friends with the Saudi royal family and King Fahd at the time. And when they went to investigate the matter, they were basically interfered with by the Saudi General Intelligence Directorate. And what they did was that when they tried to interview the neighbors and people around, the GID basically threatened these people, telling them not to help the U.S. Western government and the intelligence agency in the investigation of the bombing. And what they feared was that there was a connection with Al Qaeda and that the Saudis were helping them. There was also some rumor that the Israeli Mossad actually knew about this bombing before it happened and did warn U.S. Authorities about it. Now that's coming from Victor Ostrovsky in the book By Way of Deception. But this bombing, basically what happened was that Louis Freeh, because he was such good friends with the Saudi royal family, shut down the investigation. And then the Saudis basically, alleged that these guys that they were arrested were basically not affiliated with Al Qaeda whatsoever. They were confessed, and then they were properly hung for the crimes.
Later, March 1997, CNN interview, bin Laden denied responsibility for the attack, but he said he was sorry he had not been a participant.
Hmm.
By the time of this interview, U.S. intelligence had learned that a year and a half before the bombing took place at the Saudi National Guard facility, Al-Qaeda members and members of other aligned groups had decided to attack U.S. targets in Saudi Arabia, and they directed a team to ship explosives there. Now, this shipment is a case study in the collaboration that was going on then. The explosive, bin Laden supplied the money for purchasing the explosives. The Sudanese Ministry of Defense served as a conduit for bringing them into Sudan. They were stored briefly in the warehouse of one of bin Laden's business facilities, then transported on a bin Laden company truck under the cover of Ministry of Defense invoice papers, moved to a warehouse provided by the Ministry of Defense at a port on the Red Sea, and then transferred on a bin Laden-owned boat to Islamic Army operatives in Yemen, and from there they were moved by land to the eastern part of Saudi Arabia. So, bin Laden and his organization's role in this attack remains unclear, but the attack was consistent with the described purpose of the shipment of those explosives. On June 26, 1996, an explosion ripped through a building in Khobar Towers, an apartment complex housing U.S. Air Force personnel in Bahrain, Saudi Arabia. 19 Americans were killed, 372 were injured. Subsequent investigation concluded that the attack was carried out by a Saudi Shia Hezbollah group with assistance from Iran. Intelligence obtained shortly after the bombing, however, also supported suspicions of bin Laden's involvement. There were reports in the months preceding the attack that he was seeking to facilitate another shipment of explosives to Saudi Arabia, and on the day of the attack, he was congratulated by other members of the Islamic Army. This remains uncertain. But one thing we need to point out is that because of the historical animosity between the Shia and Sunni factions, Islamic factions, the confirmation of the Hezbollah role led many to conclude bin Laden's Sunni-populated group would not have been involved. Later intelligence, however, showed a far greater potential for collaboration between Hezbollah and al-Qaeda than many had previously thought. A few years before the attack, bin Laden's representatives and Iranian officials had discussed putting aside these differences to cooperate against a common enemy. A small group of al-Qaeda operatives...
The State Department basically tries to push this narrative of cooperation between Hezbollah and al-Qaeda, and there is none. Absolutely, there's no evidence whatsoever that Iran and al-Qaeda basically worked together to conduct a terrorist operation on the United States or the West, even though, yes, both are victims of U.S. imperialism and that they consider both of them terrorist groups. but there's absolutely zero evidence in any terrorist incident against the United States where Al-Qaeda and Hezbollah from Lebanon or Syria or Iran ever facilitated together or worked together to facilitate a terrorist operation against the West. And this is all a State Department Zionist talking point.
Personally traveled to Iran.
So it's a conspiracy made by the State Department.
And another group went to Hezbollah training camps in Lebanon for training, explosives, intelligence. And bin Laden is reported to have showed particular interest at this time in the Hezbollah truck bombing tactics used in Lebanon in 1983 that had killed 241 U.S. Marines. So in sum, we have seen now strong but indirect evidence that bin Laden's organization did in fact play some as yet unknown role in the Khobar attack. Bin Laden also explored possible cooperation with Iraq during his time in Sudan, despite his opposition to Hussein's secular regime. Bin Laden had in fact at one time sponsored anti-Saddam Islamists in Iraqi Kurdistan. The Sudanese, who wanted to protect their ties with Iraq, reportedly persuaded bin Laden to cease his support for the anti-Saddam groups and arranged for meetings between Iraq and Al-Qaeda. A senior Iraqi intelligence officer reportedly made 3 visits to Sudan and finally met with bin Laden in 1994. At that time, bin Laden is said to have requested space to establish training camps, assistance in procuring weapons, but Iraq apparently never responded. There have been reports that contacts between Iraq and Al-Qaeda also occurred after bin Laden returned to Afghanistan, but they do not appear to have resulted in a collaborative relationship. And 2 senior bin Laden associates have adamantly denied any ties existed between Al-Qaeda and Iraq.
Mm-hmm.
And so far, we have no credible evidence that Iraq and Al-Qaeda cooperated on attacks against the United States.
Well, how about that? That's in direct contradiction to what the CIA forced, or the Office of Special Plans, headed by Paul Wolfowitz, Douglas Feith, who facilitated information out of thin air to show that Al-Qaeda was basically working with Iraqi officials in procuring chemical and biological weapons. In fact, because of this information, which is basically false, which was a coerced torture confession of Abu I forgot the guy's name. He's someone that they tortured. The CIA actually, Egyptian authorities tortured to get a confession about him witnessing Al-Qaeda and Iraqi leaders procuring chemical weapons. And then that information was used by Colin Powell, the Secretary of State, at the United Nations Security Council meeting in 2003. And we went to war with Iraq, which killed about approximately up to 1 million people. And this information basically was Sheikh Ibn al-Libi was the person's name. And basically this information was fictitious. It didn't exist. And here he is, Douglas MacEachin, who was basically an Idler Commission staffer, saying right here in audio that there is no connection between Al-Qaeda and Iran and Iraq. A little bit too late.
Now, whether bin Laden and his organization had roles in the 1993 attack on the World Trade Center and on the thwarted Manila plot to blow up a dozen U.S. commercial aircraft in 1995 remains a matter of substantial uncertainty. Ramzi Youssef, the lead operative in both plots, trained in camps in Afghanistan that were funded by bin Laden and used to train many Al-Qaeda operatives. They also trained operatives from other groups, this camp. Whether Youssef was then or later became a member of Al-Qaeda remains a matter of debate. But he was, at a minimum, part of a loose network of Sunni extremist Islamists.
Ramzi Youssef was never part of Al-Qaeda. This is the problem with the State Department, is that they like to think that Arab fundamentalists are all from one same group, and they're not. Ramzi Youssef never swore bayat to bin Laden because he never met bin Laden, and neither did Khalid Sheikh Mohammed at the time until a little bit later. So even though bin Laden actually says he praised Ramzi Youssef for his participation in the 1993 World Trade Center bombing, he said that, no, I never met the brother.
Who, like bin Laden, began to focus their rage on the United States. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who provided some funding for Youssef in the 1993 World Trade Center attack and was his operational partner in the Manila plot, later did join al-Qaeda and masterminded the 9/11 attack.
Alleged.
He was not, however,
I think he did.
at the time of the Manila plot, a member of al-Qaeda.
Now, yeah, now where he got the idea was from, the idea from for 9/11 was from the Manila plot, or Bajinka plot, as it's also known, where they were going to bomb 12 airliners with uranium nitrate Timex watches bombs. And instead, an associate involved with that plot named Abdul Hakim Murad, actually, this is coming from the testimony of Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and Ramzi bin al-Shibs, so take this with a grain of salt, because they were tortured. But according to Murad, he said that too, that he told Khalid Sheikh Mohammed about the idea of having a plane manually flown by a hijacker and slam it into a U.S. target. Now, one of the parts about the Bajinka plot was that Abdul Hakim Murad, who's actually a pilot, offers his services to martyr himself to crash a plane, an American plane, into CIA Langley headquarters. Later on, when the Philippines actually arrested Abdul Hakim Murad, he actually confessed to them, saying that there was another part of the Bajinka plot, was that there were sleeper cells inside the United States, that they were going to, on orders of either Khalid Sheikh Mohammed or whoever, bin Laden or whoever, that they were going to hijack 10 planes and crash them into Sears Tower, the Golden Gate Bridge, the Pentagon, the World Trade Center, the Empire State Building, a nuclear facility, and other high-value targets. But this operation, Bajinka plot, didn't come to fruition. But the idea for 9/11 came from this.
A number of other
That's where it came from.
individuals connected to these plots or to some of the plotters who participated in them either were then or later became associates of bin Laden. But we have no conclusive evidence that at the time of these plots, any of them was operating under bin Laden's instructions.
That's right, they weren't.
But what is clear is that these plots were major benchmarks in the evolving Islamist threat to the United States, and they foreshadowed later attacks that were indisputably carried out by al-Qaeda under bin Laden's direction. Like the later attack.
I guess what MacEachin or Zelikow won't tell you as well is that the United States intelligence services, like the NSA, were listening in to bin Laden's satellite phone between 1992 to 1998. And from this satellite phone, they found out about a number that kept calling, and bin Laden kept calling it, and it was located in the capital of Sana'a in Yemen, and it became an al-Qaeda communications hub. Now, this house was owned by an individual named Ahmed al-Hada, who's an associate of bin Laden from the Afghan war. Living inside this house from time to time, well, wouldn't you know it, was a person named Khalid al-Midar. Khalid al-Midar married Ahmed al-Hada's daughter, Hoda al-Hada, making him the son-in-law. Who's Khalid al-Midar? Well, he was involved with the hijacking of American Airlines Flight 77, which crashed into the Pentagon. So from 1996 to 2001, the NSA were listening to calls on that phone line as well. And I wonder why MacEachin and Zelikow didn't mention this, even though they come and interview director of the NSA, Michael Hayden, and the director of the CIA, George Tenet, who basically stood away from these questions. I wonder why. What do you think they were talking about on those phones? And if they were talking about the operations and operations like the 1998 East Africa bombings and 9/11, which were successful, or the USS Cole bombing, which was successful, why didn't they stop it?
They were aimed at
Questions you should ask yourself.
demolishing symbols of American power and killing enormous numbers of Americans. Like bin Laden, Youssef was willing to employ any means to achieve these ends, and he contemplated the use of non-conventional weapons. In one of bin Laden's television interviews later, he characterized Ramzi Youssef as a, quote, symbol and teacher, unquote, that would drive Muslims suffering from U.S. policy to, quote, transfer the battle into the United States, close quote. In May 1996, bin Laden left Sudan and moved back to Afghanistan. This departure resulted from a combination of pressure.
The CIA actually forced this issue. Now, the CIA was actually monitoring bin Laden while he had his house in Khartoum, Sudan. And one such CIA case officer named Billy Waugh actually saw bin Laden from time to time jogging and basically related to his superiors saying that, hey, I could probably kill bin Laden here, but each time he was rebuffed. Basically, Bill Clinton, the US president, basically didn't want to have a big incident on his hands. And basically, bin Laden wasn't guilty of anything at this point. There was no terrorist operations. He was basically a financier. I mean, he was just coming on the radar for the FBI at the time. They really didn't know much about him, but the CIA knew a little bit more about him, and probably the NSA as well. But they weren't sharing this information with anybody, so nobody knew anything. So yeah, they had their chances with bin Laden. Basically, it failed each and every time. Wonder why.
From the United States,
Questions you should ask yourself.
other Western governments, and Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and Libya, all three of which faced indigenous terrorist groups supported by bin Laden. Pressure on Saddam intensified in April 1996 when the United Nations sanctioned Sudan for harboring individuals from the group that had attempted to assassinate Egyptian President Mubarak in June of '95. At the time of bin Laden's move to Afghanistan, the U.S. intelligence community
Which basically was carried out by another Egyptian group named Gamma Islamiyah. And the head of the emir of that group was the blind sheikh, Omar Abdul Rahman, who at this time was actually arrested for his participation in the landmarks plot, which was basically a plot to bomb U.S. landmarks in New York City, which actually failed because the FBI was monitoring Omar Abdul Rahman and other leaders of the Al Farouk Mosque cell, like Sadiq Ali, and 12 others who were arrested for their participation in the landmarks plots and the conspiracy to bomb U.S. Buildings. And they were all given life sentences. And Gamma Islamiyah basically went to try and kill Mubarak in a motorcade in Africa, in Ethiopia, and that failed. He managed to survive. Mubarak was much more aggressive than his counterpart Anwar Sadat, who was killed in 1980 by members of the Egyptian Islamic Jihad, was much more aggressive than Sadat in cracking down on these militants. And that's the reason why they were trying to kill Mubarak for years.
covered many details of his financial and business structures and their use to support terrorist groups. Somewhat later was when he was back in Afghanistan, the news sources disclosed the nature of his organizational structure, his commitment to attacking the United States, and the extent of his organization's involvement in attacks against the United States had already been carried out. He had some changing fortunes in Afghanistan. His departure from Sudan was a setback for him. The Saudi government had already frozen his assets 3 years earlier, and the Sudanese government expropriated all of his assets there after he left Sudan. And the financial stresses that he was undergoing then strained relations with some of his associates who used the move back to Afghanistan as an occasion to break off from al-Qaeda. There were nonetheless some benefits from the move. The Sudanese, in an effort to reduce external pressures, had sought to keep bin Laden under control and had prohibited him from making public diatribes. Afghanistan's lack of a central government gave him greater latitude to promote his own agenda. Moreover, al-Qaeda had never really left the Afghanistan region. Even when it was headquartered in Sudan, it had used Pakistan and Afghanistan as a regional base and training center supporting Islamic insurgencies in places like Tajikistan, Kashmir, and Chechnya. And in August of 1996, bin Laden made public his war against the United States. In a, quote, declaration of holy war on the Americans occupying the country of the two sacred places, close quote, Mecca and Medina and Saudi Arabia, bin Laden called on Muslims worldwide to put aside their differences and join in deadly attacks against the United States forces to compel their withdrawal from Saudi Arabia. This was a declaration we knew then that he had been making for about 4 years privately. A month later, the Taliban, an Afghan faction supported by Pakistan, seized control of Kabul, the capital of Afghanistan. Bin Laden began cementing his ties with the Taliban, and they soon forged a close alliance. Taliban paid a great price for this, in the form of outside pressure, isolation, UN sanctions, and after 9/11, the destruction of the regime.
Yeah, this is not necessarily true. The Taliban actually go by the Pashtunwali laws, which predate Islam, in that when a Muslim enters a house, it's considered an anathema or very rude to neglect him as a visitor or a guest in your home. So when bin Laden visited Afghanistan, he was there under the tutelage of then the leader of the Taliban, Mohammed Mullah Omar. And basically what happened was they couldn't reject bin Laden, even though they basically differ from his ideological perspective, and basically welcomed him to the country. But they put him under house arrest later on in 1998 because after the first fatwa, he gave a second fatwa in 98, which I'm sure MacEachin's going to relay to you in a minute, and basically brought about too much attention. The Taliban didn't want another war. They were fighting the Northern Alliance, headed by Ahmad Shah Massoud, for control of the country. What they didn't want was the United States basically involving themselves and then basically having a war for the control of the country in which the Taliban couldn't win. So they basically, in 1998, put bin Laden under house arrest along with other members of his hierarchy of al-Qaeda, like Dr. Ayman al-Zawahiri and his family, some of his family members who went with him, and basically disavowed any Western media from interviewing him after 1998, which is the reason why you didn't hear from him until 2001.
But prior to
2001.
9/11, the Taliban also benefited from a relationship with bin Laden. Bin Laden provided significant financial support to the Taliban.
He did.
And hundreds, if not thousands, of fighters to support the Taliban in its ongoing war with other factions in northern Afghanistan. From al-Qaeda's perspective, the alliance provided a sanctuary in which to train and indoctrinate recruits, import weapons, forge ties with other jihad groups and leaders, and plan terrorist operations. Al-Qaeda fighters could travel freely within the country, enter and exit without visas or any immigration procedures, and enjoy the use of official Afghan Ministry of Defense license plates. Al-Qaeda used the Afghan state-owned Ariana Airlines to courier money into the country. There were also ideological ties with the Taliban. Both Taliban and bin Laden espoused the vision of a pure Islamic state. Bin Laden reportedly swore an oath of loyalty to Taliban leader Mullah Omar.
Because Mullah Omar forced him to. Now, Taliban didn't want a war with the United States. What they wanted was to take control of Afghanistan and make it a religious state. Bin Laden had greater ideas under the influence of Dr. Ahmad Zawahiri and the members of the Egyptian Islamic Jihad to look at a war outside of Afghanistan toward the United States and Israel and the West, in which the Taliban had no idea about terrorist activities that were going to happen against the United States. And like I said, they didn't want the United States to basically come into the country that they were trying to take over from the Northern Alliance at the same time. By the way, Northern Alliance basically were trying to get help from the CIA and the State Department, and they were denied each and every time they reached out.
Relations between
So it's another question you should ask yourself.
bin Laden and Taliban leadership were sometimes tense, and some Taliban leaders opposed the al-Qaeda presence. But in the end, Mullah Omar never broke with bin Laden, and al-Qaeda. Similarly, Pakistan did not break with the Taliban until after 9/11, although it was well aware the Taliban was harboring bin Laden. The Taliban's ability to provide bin Laden a haven in the face of international pressure and UN sanctions was significantly facilitated by Pakistan's support. Pakistan benefited from the Taliban-al-Qaeda relationship, as bin Laden's camps trained and equipped fighters for Pakistan's ongoing struggle with India over Kashmir. In early 1998, bin Laden was in the early stages of what would become a merger of his al-Qaeda with another major terrorist group, the Egyptian Islamic Jihad. And on February 23rd, 1998, bin Laden and the leader of this Egyptian group, Ayman Zawahiri, who is today his deputy, number 2, published another fatwa that announced a, quote, ruling to kill Americans and their allies, close quote. This was also signed by the heads of 3 other groups, but their signatures were more for a show of unity than substance. And unlike earlier statements, this fatwa explicitly instructed followers to kill civilians and military. The decree said that this ruling was, quote, an individual duty for every Muslim who can do it in any country in which it is possible to do it, close quote. And there were new attacks on the United States that followed shortly thereafter. August 7th, 1998, nearly simultaneous truck bombs ravaged the U.S. embassies in East African capitals of Nairobi.
Yeah, there's some interest in this where I did a video about the bombing of the U.S. embassy bombings and the 9/11 plot, where the intelligence services basically probably had foreknowledge about this. And you should go look at the recent live video I did regarding the U.S. intelligence apparatuses that may have had information about prior to this bombing, including an informant that was involved with the bombing who tried to warn the CIA about this operation and was actually ignored. And later found out that this guy who actually was telling the truth, and what they did was they arrested him and then deported him back to his home country, I think, which was in Egypt at the time. So, you know, there's evidence to show that the intelligence services basically had information which could have prevented this bombing. And like I said, remember the NSA were wiretapped monitoring bin Laden's satellite phone and a house in Yemen. So were they talking about this operation on the phone? Most likely. Why didn't the NSA warn anybody?
Kenya and Dar es
Questions to ask yourself.
Salaam, Tanzania. The Nairobi embassy was destroyed. 213 people were killed, including 12 Americans, and about 5,000 were injured. In Dar es Salaam, 11 more were killed, none Americans, and 85 injured. U.S. intelligence learned a few months later that the targeting of the U.S. Embassy in Nairobi began in late 1993. It was one of more than a dozen potential U.S. targets analyzed by a team residing in the same Nairobi cell that was used to provide assistance to the Somalis. In January of 1994, al-Qaeda leaders concluded that the U.S. Embassy in Nairobi would be an easy target. Preparations for the attack, the actual implementation of the attack, did not begin in earnest until late spring of 1998, and the bombs were only assembled a few days before the attacks. The night before the embassy bombing, by that time, all al-Qaeda members except the suicide squads and a few people assigned to clean up the evidence trail had left East Africa. Bin Laden and the al-Qaeda leaders in Afghanistan had also left for the countryside in the expectation of U.S. retaliation. Need to point out the attacks on these embassies in East Africa demonstrated a new operational form for al-Qaeda. They were planned, directed, and executed by al-Qaeda under the direct supervision of bin Laden and his chief aides. And this would be seen again. On October 12, 2000, an explosives-laden boat tore through the side of the USS Cole anchored in Aden. 17 members of the Cole crew were killed and another 39 wounded. In the course of the ensuing investigation, U.S. learned that an earlier attempt to attack a U.S. warship had been made in January of that year, aimed at the USS Sullivans, but had failed because the boat was overloaded with explosives.
Yeah, that was part of the Millennium Plot, actually. There was also evidence to suggest that the USS Cole bombing could have been prevented because there was intelligence about a large al-Qaeda affiliate group located in Yemen that were looking to bomb a U.S. warship. Now, for example, I gave what MacEachin basically brought up was the U.S. Sullivan's was going to be a target. Now, that's January of 2000. So there was warnings out there saying that, hey, we need to basically ramp up security and basically provide stricter measures regarding warships in this area of the country or this region. And they did not, basically. So, and that warning was related to the captain of the USS Cole. I forgot his name, but basically he complained about refueling at the port because the previous intelligence warnings was that, they're looking to bomb the USS warship.
The boat was salvaged, a new martyr crew was selected, and the attack successfully carried out 10 months later. The operational commander of this attack, a person named Nashiri, had previously assisted one of the African embassy bombers. He arrived in Yemen in late 1999 to supervise the purchase of the boat used in the attack and direct the casing and execution of the attacks. He was assisted by an al-Qaeda member close to bin Laden, went by the name of Khalad or Tawfiq Atash. Khalad was the person who purchased the explosives used in the attack, and Khalad had also been identified as connected to the East Africa bombings. This attack followed the operational pattern shown in the East African bombings in that it was directed by al-Qaeda operatives using equipment and explosives purchased by al-Qaeda funds and carried out by members of al-Qaeda willing to be martyrs for the cause. By mid-November 2000, U.S. investigators were aware of the roles of Nashiri and Khalad and aware that they were senior al-Qaeda operatives. The one point that could not be ascertained at the time was whether they had carried out that attack under direct orders from bin Laden himself. This would not be confirmed until Nashiri and Khalad were captured in November of 2002 and April 2003, respectively. At the same time, two disrupted millennium plots demonstrated that bin Laden remained willing to provide support to attacks initiated by independent actors. Neither intended millennium attack was a traditional al-Qaeda operation. Rather, both were planned and orchestrated by independent extremist groups, which received training and assistance from al-Qaeda figures. One was a plot to destroy hotels and tourist sites in Amman, Jordan. It was planned and carried out by a Palestinian radical and his partner, an American citizen, who sought to kill Americans there. The other was the attempted bombing of Los Angeles International Airport. It was orchestrated by a person named Rassam, who conceived and prepared for the attack on his own.
By the way, involved with that plot as well is a nefarious individual that would later have reverberating effects later on in Iraq specifically, as well as in Syria later on, is Abu Musab al-Zarqawi. And if you don't know who that is, he actually was in charge of creating the group called the Wal Jihad group. I forgot the whole name of it, but it later became known as Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which later became the Islamic State in Iraq and later became the Islamic State and the Levant. Abu Musab al-Zarqawi was actually a pimp and a murderer who later became radicalized under the tutelage of a very notable Salafist preacher based in Jordan, Muhammad al-Makdisi, who was considered one of the most dangerous ideological Salafists in the Middle East today even.
He commented after his arrest that he had offered to let bin Laden take credit for the attack in return for providing Rassam future funding. Both Rassam and the Jordanian cell took what they needed from al-Qaeda associated camps and personnel, but did not follow the traditional al-Qaeda top-down planning and approval model. Let me quick look at some terrorist training camps. Many of the operatives in the African embassy and Cole attacks attended training camps in Afghanistan, as did all 19 of the 9/11 hijackers. There was a mutually reinforcing relationship between the camps and terrorist operations. The camps provided the operatives for the terrorist attacks. Successful attacks boosted camp recruitment and attendance. The
A
quality
lot of those camps were actually built under the finances of the CIA Operation Cyclone, right? Incidentally, Wal Jihad training camp, Al Farouk training camp, Darunta, um, uh, Kaldeen, a lot of these training camps basically who trained all these people that were used in these terrorist operations all throughout the late 1990s, early 2000s, all came from these Saudi-funded, Pakistan ISI, CIA-funded money.
training provided at Al-Qaeda and other
Incidentally.
jihadist camps was apparently quite good. There was coordination with regard to curriculum, emphasis on ideological and religious indoctrination, and instruction that underscored that the United States and Israel were evil and that the rulers of Arab countries were illegitimate. The camps created a climate in which trainees and other personnel were free to think creatively about ways to commit mass murder. According to a senior al-Qaeda associate, various ideas were floated by mujahideen in Afghanistan, such as taking over a launcher and forcing Russian scientists to fire a nuclear missile at the United States, mounting mustard gas or cyanide attacks against Jewish areas in Iran, dispensing poison gas into the air conditioning system of a targeted building, and last but not least, hijacking an aircraft and crashing it into an airport terminal or nearby city. These camps were able to operate only because of the worldwide network of recruiters, travel facilitators, and document forgers who vetted would-be trainees and helped them get in and out of Afghanistan. There are strong indications that elements of both the Pakistani and Iranian governments frequently turned a blind eye to this transit to their respective countries. We can
Yeah, while that's all that is true, you also had the intelligence services like Israel, Saudi Arabia, the United States, who basically were monitoring these people for years and didn't share any information. Now, I wonder why, the 9/11 Commission isn't saying anything about that. Well, I know why, but I'm just saying, they're not being very forthcoming here.
conservatively say that thousands of men, perhaps as many as 20,000, trained in bin Laden-supported camps in Afghanistan between his May 1996 return and September 11th, 2001. And of those,
I don't know where he got that number from. I don't know.
only a small percentage went on to receive the advanced terrorist training.
We should stress that what we know now is different from what we may have known at the time. Some of what we have described was known at the time, some of it was only known much later, as we've been explaining in the course of this statement. Let me turn to the funding of al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. After establishing itself in Afghanistan, al-Qaeda relied on well-placed financial facilitators and diversions of funds from Islamic charities. The financial facilitators raised money from witting and unwitting donors, primarily in the Gulf countries and particularly in Saudi Arabia. The facilitators also appeared to rely heavily.
Actually, to expunge on this, Saudi Arabia actually was paying like blackmail money to these Salafist groups under bin Laden and bin Laden affiliated groups like Abu Sayyaf so that they couldn't, so they wouldn't bomb Saudi Arabia because they were still having the United States military base stationed in the two most holiest sites of Islam, Mecca and Medina. So what they did was you had these Saudi sympathizers within the family. The Saudi royal family basically is approximately like 5,000 people. So it's not like everybody in the family basically didn't like bin Laden. I mean, bin Laden had a huge family and they were actually a very wealthy family inside the kingdom. The Saudi bin Laden Group, which is the largest construction company in Saudi Arabia at the time, basically reformatted or refurbished Mecca and Medina, was given very lucrative contracts, and basically had a lot of associates and friends within the family and within the Wahhabi clan of Saudi Arabia. So you had a lot of sympathizers that agreed with bin Laden, and you got, like Zelikow said, this is actually true, a lot of unwitting people that were giving money to these charities. Basically, some of these charities basically were conduits for these Salafist-minded groups like Al-Qaeda and Jemaah Islamiyah and Abu Sayyaf in Southeast Asia.
On certain imams
So there's some truth to what Zelikow is saying here, but he's not telling you.
at mosques, also primarily in the Gulf countries, who are willing to divert mandatory charitable contributions known as zakat. Al-Qaeda also collected money from employees of corrupted charities. Operatives either penetrated specific foreign branch offices of large international charities, particularly those with lax external oversight and ineffective internal controls.
So bin Laden had a brother-in-law named Mohammed Jamal Khalifa, who basically opened up these legitimate shops in Philippines and Indonesia. And a lot of these businesses were basically just money fronts for Al-Qaeda because he was connected to Al-Qaeda and the bin Laden unit. So that's where some money was also coming from. And also, he was alleged to have been involved in the drug trade, which basically was facilitated by these very powerful drug lords in Jalalabad and Islamabad and in Pakistan and in Afghanistan. So bin Laden was getting a piece of money from there, but that doesn't tell you everything. I mean, where else was money coming from? Was it coming from Pakistan? Was it coming from the CIA? Was it coming from other elements that were covered up by the State Department in the 9/11 Pent Bomb investigation or the 9/11 Commission? Well, we won't know because they didn't reveal everything. And a lot of this stuff is classified, or a lot of this stuff was basically not allowed to be a part of the 9/11 Commission report. You got to ask yourself why.
Or they controlled
Why?
entire smaller charities, including access to their bank accounts. There is no convincing evidence that any government financially supported Al-Qaeda before 9/11.
Well, that's not true anymore because now we do have evidence that the Saudi government, through a Saudi intermediary named Omar al-Bayoumi, was actually giving money to two Al-Qaeda operatives that were involved with the 9/11 plots, Khalid al-Mihdhar and Nawaf al-Hazmi.
Than limited support provided by the Taliban after bin Laden first arrived in Afghanistan.
See, this is the State Department basically covering up for the Saudis, and they still manage to do that today. Why isn't this talked about in 9/11 Truth Movement? Because they don't believe in hijackers or hijacked planes.
This may have turned a blind eye to Al-Qaeda's fundraising activities. Saudi Arabia has long been considered the primary source of Al-Qaeda funding, but we found no evidence that the Saudi government as an institution or senior officials within the Saudi government funded Al-Qaeda. Still,
yeah, well, I mean, we already knew that at some point that there was Saudi government financing of the hijackers. In fact, we do have evidence that there was a bank account from Riggs Bank that was an account belonging to Haifa bin Faisal, who's the wife of former U.S. Saudi ambassador Bandar bin Sultan, who basically was giving money to his wife. And that woman then was giving money to another woman who was married to Omar al-Bayoumi, and another woman that was married to Osama Bastan named Mawida Dwijak, who basically was giving that money to Khalid al-Mihdhar and Nawaf al-Hazmi. Now, what we did know at the time was whether this was deliberate on the part of Bandar bin Sultan, but now it's come out through the latest cache of files from the FBI under the Biden administration of 2021, where it was part of Operation Encore, where, yes, we now know, because it's declassified, that there was a Saudi government official that basically was paying off an intermediary to two Al-Qaeda operatives who were involved with 9/11.
Al-Qaeda found fertile.
We do now know. And why does the State Department continue to cover up Saudi Arabia?
Fundraising in the kingdom, where extreme religious views are common and charitable giving is essential to the culture, and until recently, subject to very limited oversight. The United States has never been a primary source of Al-Qaeda funding, although some funds raised in the United States likely made their way to Al-Qaeda. No persuasive evidence exists that Al-Qaeda relied on the drug trade as an important source of revenue or funded itself through trafficking in diamonds from African states engaged in civil wars. After raising money, Al-Qaeda frequently moved its money by hawala, an informal and ancient trust-based system for transferring funds. Al-Qaeda also used couriers as a secure, albeit slower, way to move funds. Bin Laden relied on the established hawala networks operating in Pakistan, United Arab Emirates, and throughout the Middle East to transfer funds efficiently. Hawaladars associated with Al-Qaeda may have used banks to move and store money, as did various al-Qaeda fundraisers and operatives outside of Afghanistan. But there is little evidence that bin Laden or his core al-Qaeda members used banks during this period. Al-Qaeda's money was distributed as quickly as it was raised. What was made was spent. The CIA estimates that al-Qaeda spent $30 million annually, including paying for terrorist operations, maintaining terrorist training camps, paying salaries to jihadists, contributing to the Taliban, funding fighters in Afghanistan, and sporadically contributing to related terrorist
Where's
organizations.
all that money coming from, by the way? And it's not, that's not public, by the way. Some of it may be, but not everything. Why not declassify everything? Why are we still classifying information relating to, say, 9/11? You can't say it's national security interests. Not every page is basically threatening to illuminate national security measures in the United States. I mean, what are we covering up Saudi Arabia for? Why do we continue to basically cover up their role for 9/11?
The largest expense was payments to the Taliban, which totaled an estimated $10 to $20 million per year. Actual terrorist operations were relatively cheap, although there is evidence that al-Qaeda experienced funding shortfalls as part of the cyclical fundraising process, with more money coming during the holy month of Ramadan. We are not aware of any evidence indicating that terrorist acts were interrupted as a result. Al-Qaeda today. Since the September 11th attacks and the defeat of the Taliban, al-Qaeda's funding has decreased significantly. The arrests or deaths of several important financial facilitators has decreased the amount of money al-Qaeda has raised and increased the costs and difficulty of raising and moving that money. Some entirely corrupt charities are now out of business, with many of their principals killed or captured, although some charities may still be providing support to al-Qaeda. Moreover, it appears that the al-Qaeda attacks within Saudi Arabia in May and November of 2003 have reduced, perhaps drastically, al-Qaeda's ability to raise funds from Saudi sources. Both an increase in Saudi enforcement and a more negative perception of al-Qaeda by potential donors have cut its income. At the same time, al-Qaeda's expenditures have decreased as well, largely because it no longer provides substantial funding to the Taliban or runs a network of training camps in Afghanistan. Despite the apparent reduction in overall funding, it remains relatively easy for al-Qaeda to find the relatively small sums required to fund terrorist operations. Prior to 9/11, al-Qaeda was a centralized organization which used Afghanistan as a war room to strategize, plan attacks, and dispatch operatives worldwide. Bin Laden approved all al-Qaeda operations, often selecting the target and the operatives. After al-Qaeda lost Afghanistan after 9/11, it fundamentally changed. The organization is far more decentralized. Bin Laden's seclusion forced operational commanders and cell leaders to assume greater authority. They are now making the command decisions previously made by him. Bin Laden continues to inspire many of the operatives he trained and dispersed, as well as smaller Islamic extremist groups and individual fighters who share his ideology. As a result, al-Qaeda today is more a loose collection of regional networks with a greatly weakened central organization. It pushes these networks to carry out attacks and assists them by providing guidance, funding, and training in skills such as bomb making or urban combat. Al-Qaeda remains intensely interested in conducting chemical, biological, radiological, or nuclear attacks.
Which they'd never done before anyway. And even though they had interest in doing it, they never did it anyway. I mean, that's what the United States basically tried to imply, that al-Qaeda was trying to build nuclear and chemical weapons with Iraq, and basically made up that information.
In 1994, al-Qaeda operatives attempted to purchase uranium for $1.5 million. The uranium proved to be fake. Though this attempt failed, al-Qaeda continues to pursue its strategic objective of obtaining a nuclear weapon. Likewise, it remains interested in using a radiological dispersal device, or dirty bomb, a conventional explosive designed to spread radioactive material. Documents found in al-Qaeda facilities contain accurate information on the usage and impact of such weapons. Al-Qaeda had an ambitious biological weapons program and was making advances in its ability to produce anthrax prior to September 11th. According to Director of Central Intelligence George Tenet, al-Qaeda's ability to conduct an anthrax attack is one of the most immediate threats the United States is likely to face.
And there's no evidence to suggest that they had any interest in anthrax whatsoever, and that they were involved with the anthrax attacks. There's no evidence to suggest that either. Actually, the anthrax that was used to actually kill, I think it was 2 or 3 people, was basically like a cutaneous type, a wet type of anthrax that was facilitated in a lab in Ames, Iowa, which is actually named after the Ames strain anthrax, named after the biochemical weapons lab in Ames, Iowa State, which houses the largest archive of anthrax. But after the anthrax attacks letters, the FBI destroyed the anthrax archive. Why? Why'd they do that?
Similarly,
Questions you have to ask yourself.
Al-Qaeda may seek to conduct a chemical attack by using widely available industrial chemicals or by attacking a chemical plant or a shipment of hazardous materials. The intelligence community expects that the trend toward attacks intended to cause ever higher casualties will continue. Al-Qaeda and other extremist groups will likely continue to exploit leaks of national security information in the media, open source information on techniques such as mixing explosives and advances in electronics. It may modify traditional tactics in order to prevent detection or interdiction by counter-terrorist forces. Regardless of the tactic, Al-Qaeda is actively striving to attack the United States and inflict mass casualties.
Okay, well, that's basically it. I mean, but there's a lot of history here that was actually either ignored or not known to the 9/11 Commission staffers. I would like to say that they probably knew a lot of this history and just didn't want to report it for whatever reason, because there is a connection to the intelligence services. How long, we still don't know. A lot of stuff is classified. Some of it's public. And a lot of the stuff that I related to you today is public. That is actually known. So that's about it for this video. I'll see you in the next breakdown video, which I'll do pretty much soon because I haven't done these in a while. Have a good night, everybody.